Hello everybody, it's been a while, but I'm back. This week, I'm going to be kitbashing an awesome captain on bike for Whatthe40k. Let's start this collaboration video, I'm looking forward to it. So the basis for this conversion is going to be this Primaris chaplain on bike, which at the moment is the only character we have left for the new Space Marine Codex, who happens to be on a bike. But the YouTube channel Whatthe40k doesn't care about that and is still happy to have a captain on a bike, so as someone after my own heart. We all know that I love my white scars, and captains on bike, definitely a part of that army. So let's kitbash a really cool one that they can be proud of. The thought behind this is a model swap, so we're going to be creating one of the models from each of our custom chapters and swapping them. They're going to be crossing the pond from Canada to the UK and hopefully find a nice place at the centre of the other person's army. For me, the Voidwalkers are being chosen and we're going to be looking at a super cool Breacher captain, essentially the captain from the old Indomitus box, but kitted out in all that nice Gravis armour like the rest of my Voidwalkers. Now my part of the deal is to make that captain on bike, and it's going to be for the Firekeepers, who are a renowned monster hunting chapter, and we're going to be coming onto them a bit more later. Now as alluded to, this is a kitbash, so there are going to be a few changes. The first thing was to cut off the right hand arm because I didn't want him to be holding a Crozius, I wanted him to be holding a giant spear, so we'll get back to that shortly. I took the front half of the torso and took some putty at the same time and covered up all the skeletal gaps. We don't want this guy to look like he has a ribcage, that's very chaplain looking, we're keeping him in that captain format, so using a bit of brown stuff, other brands are available, I filled in all the gaps. Using water and Vaseline to make sure that my fingerprints weren't left behind, I made sure that everything was brushed clean and then attached the two halves of the torso together. You'll see there's a big old hole in the right arm now, but we're going to fix that when we attach the new, cool looking pointing weapon hand. For the time being though, it's back to the normal instructions of attaching the legs and torso to the bike. Now we're going to an incursor, or infiltrator, doesn't really matter which, hand with the 3 pointing fingers. I cut off the hand, make sure everything's tidied up, and then see about fitting it to the torso. After dry fitting, I realised there was still going to be quite a large gap, so I super glued this arm on for that slight bit more strength and a more instant bond, and then put what was left of my putty into the armpit area to cover up the gap. Then dry fitting the Guardian Spear from the Custodes kit, I realised that I'd need to make a few cuts before it would fit the wrist. And then as always with anything spindly, pinning is the best way to go. Drilling some 1mm holes and then using some 1mm wire and super glue to attach everything together and make sure there's a really nice strong bond. One of the key things to note about this kitbash is it's not meant to be an exact guide on how to make a cool looking captain on bike. There are a few bits I get wrong and you'll see that throughout, but I end up finding weird solutions to get through it. So my advice would be take this more as inspiration rather than step by step of how to do this. I attached the handlebars and left arm as per the instructions and then moved on to a part that I was quite looking forward to, but was very unsure if it was going to work or not. I rolled out a big sheet of brown stuff, made sure it was covered in loads of Vaseline so it didn't stick to the box. If you have another flat surface that works too, but my cutting mat is a mess, so I used the box, and then I cut it into the shape of what could look like a cloak. The image I had in my head for how this model should finally look is a captain on an outcrop above his troops, pointing his spear forward with his cloak billowing behind him. I thought that'd be a really cool way to build in the sculpt of the chaplain with his 1 foot on the floor and the bike obviously not moving, but still adding a ton of motion to the model. So by building this cloak, I was doing step 1 of that process. After being cut to shape, I decided to leave the putty to cure for some time so it would be a little bit easier to work with and a bit more solid and rigid. So in this time, I decided to take the captain shoulder pad from one of the many Space Marine kits that are out there and cut it to size to fit over that incursor arm. The right hand shoulder pads on those arms are slightly larger than other kits that you have out there, so a bit of back and forth was required. I really like the extra weight this added to his right arm. It felt like a lot more armour, and whilst it's not quite the same as a knight jousting and being armoured up on the left where they expect to get hit, it's a nice little feature for this captain. Now the cloak was semi-cured, it was time to work it into the model. I did this through a few methods, mainly using fingers that were covered in water so I didn't get my fingerprints everywhere, and a toothpick. This gave me the initial shape I needed, and again, as always with any kind of sculpting or kitbashing, there was a lot of back and forth as I figured out exactly where I wanted things to go. I'd made the cloak slightly too long on one side, but I decided to incorporate this into the model and drag it round so it could be pinned in place by a brooch. I used a small amount of super glue to fix that to the left hand side of its chest, and then using my toothpick and fingers again, started adding the folds and creating the shape of the cloak behind him in that currently non-existent wind. Now, brown stuff is not the best for sculpting stuff like this. It's very soft and quite flexible, so whilst great for things like basing and using texture rollers, it's not so good for this. But it's all I had. If you're using green stuff, you shouldn't have too much of an issue, but the way I got around this was by using some super glue and spreading it across the top of the surface once I had it in a position that I liked it. I've never quite done something like this before, and I'm really pleased with the result. It's definitely going to be better with practice, but for this, I think it works. It adds a lot of motion to an otherwise quite static model. As to how I applied the super glue to force the cloak into shape, I just added a thin layer and then scraped it over the place with the toothpick, just to thin it out so we didn't end up with any large blobs. Once I was happy with the positioning to secure the cloak in place, I added that aforementioned brooch, in this case a tilting plate. For the helmet, I used a helmet from the Iron Hands upgrade sprue because it has a cool little ocular that makes him look different to everybody else. Now, as the chapter name is the Firekeepers, I took this 3D printed brazier from a kit from March of War. The link will be in the description below if you ever want anything like it. I fitted that to the top of his backpack and then started working on some trophies. As mentioned previously, these guys are monster hunters, so I wanted to employ that on the bike instead of the book that you normally get. So using a Thunder Cavalry wolf head and some green stuff putty from a tube, I made a really gory looking head that's been severed and attached to the top. For an extra little bit of detail and for some recycling, I used the toothpick I've been using all day, snapped it down and added the bone sticking out of the neck. After a bit of tidying up and making sure that the bone was about the right size for the head it was attached to, and also making it still look like somewhat of a clean cut, I attached it to the bike. The initial place I wanted to attach it was on top, where on the normal Primaris Chaplain model there is that giant book. To me it made sense as there's a divot in the top that's meant to slot the book in, so I attached the head there with some super glue and then ran out and bought some 2mm chain because I've run out after doing all my Black Templars. Then using some super glue I ran this all over the head and attached it to the top of the bike. Once the chain was attached I ran super glue all over it to make sure it would stay still when it was time to paint. Here's where we are at the moment, but after a bit of feedback it was decided that we didn't really like where the wolf head was. It was blocking the captain's view. Now, what I personally didn't mind that, it's not my model, so I of course acquiesced and changed it. I shaved down the wolf head and made sure it could fit on the side of the bike. I was a bit inspired by The Witcher 3 where Geralt rides around with his trophy kills hanging off the side of Roach, his horse, and thought it would look cool here too. To cover up the big gap in the top, I added a wolf head, 3D printed by March of War, and then found this cool, vampiric, weird looking demon skull and chained that to the other side for a bit of symmetry. Now this guy must be an absolutely accomplished monster hunter, and that spear has taken many lives in service of the Emperor. And I'm a big fan of that. It tells a really cool story with all those trophies hanging off the front. And that brings us to the end of the kit bashing part of the video and time to start on the painting. But before we do, here's the final look with all the 3D printed parts and sculpted parts before I cover it with black primer. I'm really pleased with how well the sculpting went, especially as I used some unconventional methods and some weird techniques that I've never used before. So let's crack on with the painting. The Firekeepers are green by nature, so I started with a nice base coat of Caliban green through the airbrush, followed by some warpstone glow to give them a really bright aesthetic. The whole point of this collaboration is to add a little bit of ourselves into the model, so I'm going to be painting this in the way that I paint a lot of my Space Marine armies, and it's going to be quite vibrant and saturated. So with that in mind, I started off with a recess, or panel liner if you like, of Black Legion paint, as I do with my salamanders. I find this adds a lot of contrast and makes things look really cool when you get to the highlight stage. Speaking of the highlight stage, I used moot green as a nice edge highlight all over the panels, and it's at this point the model really started to pop. If you're a long-time follower of this channel, you've seen me edge highlight many things, and I still think it's an absolutely excellent way to learn brush control and patience. And believe me, whilst, like me, you'll start off by disliking it, you'll learn to love it, and it becomes a very zen place to be. Now, as for the right-hand shoulder pad, this would normally be gold, but this is a third company captain, so he has a red shoulder pad. There's no trim to paint, so I covered the entire eagle to keep him in line with his troops. All the other trim ended up gold though, because he is a captain and he's got to have some bling. I'm not going to go too in depth on much of the rest of the base coating. You know how it's done. I added some silvers and the skulls and all these other things. The bit I want to draw your attention to is the spear. I painted this white with pale grey blue from Vallejo, which, again, if you've been around for a while, is one of my favourite paints, and then used contrast Iandan yellow all over it. The weapons are usually somewhat fire-based, so I went with the yellow base coat and then, whilst it was still wet, blended in an orange base coat on top. In this case, Gryph-hound orange. Whilst it's going to end up mostly orange, that yellow will still show through, as all contrast paints are slightly translucent, so you'll see that base layer. Once these base coats had dry and the blend was looking really nice, I went in with Ushabti bone as a first highlight all over, and then did a really nice sharp highlight with pale sand. A bright edge highlight on a weapon to make it look sharp will cover up even the dodgiest of blends, so I do recommend giving it a go. Skipping ahead again, let's look at the basing. I painted all the rocks that come with the model white, so I could cover it later with Basilicanum Grey contrast paint, which creates a really nice stone texture. And that's all we need to do for the stones. We'll come back to them in a second, because as they dried, I did a final spot highlight on the armour with livery green to make it really look like it stands out. Now back to the basing, I used desert sand, which I picked up especially for this basing scheme, and once that was dry, got some ochre earth from Abteilung 502 pigments and put it all over the bike, making sure to cover the base and the side of the bike so he looks dusty. The final step was to add a salamander's transfer and add the spike that marks him out as a firekeeper. That marks the end of another video. I was really excited about this collaboration, so please go and check out Whatthe40k's channel, linked in the description below. It's really great to be back. I hope you enjoyed the final result. As always, I've been Sam. See you next time.